Thank you for that presentation. I think it's probably one of the clearest articulations that links the importance of economic growth, the role of trade in that space, and American leadership, particularly as you point out during the period of growing economic uncertainty globally. And you pointed out, I think, interestingly and quite accurately, the cost of delay in economic terms, and you've also talked about the strategic importance of the TPP, and there's strategic costs of delay to some extent as well. We know that the TPP ultimately will play the role that we imagine and hope it can play once it's been passed through Congress. You talked about the importance of that. I feel I need to ask you specifically if you can elaborate a little bit more on what the administration's hope is in terms of the timing of that passage through Congress.
Well, I'm not sure this is on, so maybe I'll just give you the answer, but nobody will hear. So can people hear me in the back? Great. So, look, Josh, I think all we can say on that topic is we are working every day to get TPP passed as quickly as possible. And it's not just for the commercial reasons that I mentioned in my remarks, frankly, but it is also because of the importance of extending American leadership around the world. I will tell you that having been in the deal business for many years, it is very difficult to predict the timing of deals because in this particular case there are many complicated factors that are going into it. But we're working every day and we're hopeful that it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And as I said in my remarks, we're doing everything we can to get it done during this administration.
Thanks. One of the things you touched on in your speech, which is, I think, an important part of the services component of TPP, is how it helps supply chains and global supply chains. Is that something you could elaborate on a little bit?
Sure. Look, I mentioned a couple of things as it relates to supply chains in my remarks, and I think two of the most obvious are the implications for TPP on tariffs. As I mentioned, what this will do, the agreement itself will create an almost seamless region that will be free of tariffs across 12 countries virtually on day one. And in fact, from the United States perspective, that means that 98% of all non-agricultural goods will be eligible for duty-free access straight out of the gate. The other issue, of course, relates to trade facilitation. We have introduced a number of customs issues designed to support supply chains in TPP, which includes providing expedited customs systems to process express delivery services, enhanced predictability by requiring countries to provide advanced customs rulings, as well as the de minimis value threshold I mentioned in my remarks. And so those, I think, are the two most obvious ones, but I would mention three others that people often don't necessarily think of in the context of supply chains, and that's transparency, global standards, and anti-corruption. And all three of those are obviously important in all bilateral trade agreements, but now as the supply chains become more interconnected and more interdependent, making the progress that we've made on those three areas, I think, is even more profound in the context of supply chains.
Thank you. I might open it up to the audience for Q&A. There's a couple of roving microphones. This lady up the back here, please.
I'm not sure we have the microphone right now, so if you could just...
I'll just project. I'm Victoria Guido with Politico. My question is about, in the customs bill, there was a provision added to TPA that said that the United States can't negotiate on visas and changes to immigration policy. And I was wondering if you thought that that was something that, even though the U.S. didn't negotiate in TPP, that was going to handicap the U.S. moving forward.
Look, I'd say a couple things. One is visas are primarily handled by the State Department, not by the Department of Commerce. And you're quite right, it was not something that we dealt with in TPP. I think it is not something that we view as a competitive disadvantage given the overall strength of this agreement. And it isn't something that we believe needed to be included in this agreement to give it all the benefits that I've highlighted.
Yep, I'll be back.
Thank you. Dave Snyder, Property Casualty Insurance Association of America. Thank you very much for the administration's work on this agreement. We totally support it. However, there is an issue in financial services and data localization rules, and I'm wondering if that's something that we can work with the administration and Congress on stronger provisions regarding that. And finally, what do you think is the #1 opposition point that we collectively ought to be addressing in support of the work that we've done? Thank you.
Let's see. So let's do those two things separately. Of course, since I mentioned it in my remarks, we're quite aware of the issues around data localization in financial services. A number of congressmen sent a letter to secretaries yesterday on this topic. And look, what we are trying to do here is to most adeptly approach a balancing act in some ways. And that balancing act, of course, is to fulfill our domestic regulatory objectives while also advancing what is our shared goal with your industry of supporting free trade and the free flow of data for American industry and American workers. And that balance, of course, is something that we are continuing to talk about. What I would say is I would not lose the light for the candle here, right? And so the fact is as I've often said as a deal guy, this is a complicated 12-handed agreement with countries of wildly different sizes and wildly different levels of economic development. And as a former financial services executive, I can tell you that I think it is unequivocal that TPP represents an unquestionable win for the American financial services industry. And I would try and avoid the nitpicking of trying to imagine by each industry sector what one particular provision might have been better in the context of a potential negotiation, without, I think, the realism of what a 12-handed, complicated negotiation really is. So that's one. I think maybe that segues into the second question is what can we and should we be doing? And so I think the last part of the answer would be part of that, which is let's not lose the forest for the trees and focus on how much better each and every American industry is as a result of TPP getting enacted than it is today. The second thing I guess I would say is something I focused on in my remarks, which is not just to look at this as just a commercial and a trade deal, but fundamentally a reflection of changes that are going on in the world and how the United States can and should best position itself to take advantage of that changing and dynamic environment in which we're living.
Stefan, I think that's all the time we have for.
Okay. Yeah, I think we had time for one more question. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Dan Pearson, Cato Institute. I understand that the administration is reluctant to consider any type of renegotiation of TPP, and I realize that could be complex. But how do you respond to the argument that on the issue of financial services data localization, a renegotiation actually might be possible, because it largely would involve a negotiation between the United States and the United States, between Treasury and USTR. And that once that agreement was reached, the other countries might be willing to accept it.
Let me just start out with, I guess, a contradiction to your premise and be kind of bright and clear and unequivocal. Renegotiation is not an option. We're not going to do it, and we're not going to do it because we fought hard over the past 5 years to get where we are. I believe we got the best deal we could get. and I'm highly confident that we have done just that. And I would harken back to a remark I just made. This is not a bilateral, simple agreement. It is a 12-handed agreement, and as a result of that 12-handed agreement, all of these pieces fit together, and opening this up in any respect, on any particular topic, I think would have the whole agreement come crumbling down like a house of cards. So while I appreciate that there are a whole host of issues that we can continue to talk about in a constructive way, one of the alternatives is not going to be to open up this agreement to renegotiation. And again, as I said, having been a deal maker, the notion of us being able to do that without fundamentally imperiling the agreement itself, I think, is unrealistic in the way that you've just described.